dive. Today we're going to be looking at some pretty heavy stuff. We're talking about the allegations against Neil Gaiman. And, I know this is a really tough one for a lot of people, especially those of us who, kind of found solace and escape in his work over the years.
Yeah, I think for a lot of fans, this is going to be a really difficult conversation.
Absolutely. And, we're approaching this with a lot of sensitivity. I think it's important to say that right off the bat. We're going to be focusing on two main sources for this deep dive. The first is the Tortoise Media podcast Master, which features firsthand accounts from a number of women, and then also this really in-depth article from New York Magazine titled "There Is No Safe Word."
And I think what's really important to remember is that, this isn't about, tearing down Neil Gaiman or, trying to invalidate his work.
All right, this isn't a literary analysis.
Exactly. This is about trying to grapple with some really serious accusations and, how do we as fans try to understand this situation?
Yeah, how do we reconcile this with the art that we love?
That's a really good question. And I think, one of the things that makes this case so compelling is how these allegations clash with the very carefully constructed online persona that Gaiman has cultivated over the years.
Right.
He was an early adopter of blogging, Twitter, Tumblr, and he always seemed to use those platforms to genuinely connect with fans.
Yeah, it wasn't just about promoting his work or anything like that. It was like he was really engaging with people.
Exactly. He would answer questions. He would offer advice to aspiring writers. He really fostered this image of being accessible and, almost like a friend.
It was almost like, that cool, wise uncle that you could, chat with online.
Exactly.
Yeah, and let's not forget, his very outspoken support for feminist causes.
Yeah.
He really aligned himself with those progressive values, which makes these accusations all the more perplexing.
It creates this dissonance that's really hard to reconcile.
Yeah, it's like, how do we square these two things?
Right, because it's not just about a celebrity scandal. This is about, trying to understand how someone who presented themselves as an ally could potentially be capable of the harm that's being described.
Exactly. So let's start by unpacking the initial allegations from Tortoise Media's podcast. 5 women came forward with accounts that were pretty harrowing. We're talking accusations of physical and sexual assault, coercive control, even rape.
Wow.
I think before we go any further, it's really important to define what we mean by coercive control, because it's not always about physical violence, right? It's about this pattern of behavior that seeks to dominate and control another person. This can include things like isolating them from friends and family, manipulating them financially, undermining their self-esteem. It's these subtle, insidious tactics that can be incredibly damaging.
And that's really what's striking about the podcast is how they highlight the inherent power imbalance in these situations.
Right.
Many of these women were young fans, some were at vulnerable points in their lives.
Right. And that makes the power dynamic even more significant.
It really raises questions about whether genuine consent can even exist when one party holds so much influence over the other.
Absolutely. The New York Magazine publishes their article, and things get even more complicated. 3 more women come forward, running the total to 8 accusers. And their stories include these very detailed accounts of abuse, some of them occurring while Gaiman's young son was allegedly present.
Oh, wow.
So this is where the article really starts to lay out specific instances of misconduct and the supporting evidence they have for it.
And one of the most impactful elements of the New York Magazine piece is the introduction of Starlet Pavlovich, who was the family's nanny.
Right.
Her allegations add a whole other layer of complexity to the story.
Yeah, because she claims that she was exploited and worked without pay, which suggests a potential pattern of behavior that extends beyond just the sexual misconduct.
Absolutely.
And this is where it gets really unsettling because, her account raises questions about the environment within the Gaiman-Palmer household. Was this a place where boundaries were routinely blurred, or was this an isolated incident?
That's a really important question to consider.
Right.
And it's important to remember that, we are dealing with accusations. Gaiman has denied any wrongdoing. He maintains that all of his relationships were consensual. But Pavlovich's story is particularly troubling because she describes being young and homeless and reliant on the Gaiman-Palmer family for support, which makes her incredibly vulnerable to this type of exploitation.
Right. She had no power in that situation.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just infidelity and raises these concerns about potential financial and emotional manipulation.
Yeah, it's a really complicated situation. You're absolutely right. And her story, along with the stories of these other women, has left fans reeling. There's this sense of betrayal and disillusionment, and I think a lot of folks are just struggling with how to process it all. We're going to dive deeper into the fan reaction in a little bit, but first I want to go back to the New York Magazine article for a moment because they lay out some pretty compelling evidence to support the accuser's claims. They reference text messages, emails, other forms of documentation that seem to corroborate these stories.
It's that contemporaneous evidence that is so crucial in these cases.
Right.
Because it provides a timeline, it helps establish patterns, and it can be incredibly powerful in supporting a claim. However, it's equally important to acknowledge that even with this evidence, there are often conflicting narratives. And it's in that gray area where things aren't so black and white that things get really challenging.
Yeah, you can't just, jump to conclusions.
Right, we have to consider all perspectives and avoid making judgments.
Absolutely. And it's important to note that Gaiman does address some of these accusations. While he maintains that everything was consensual, he does admit to having relationships with some of the women. So this, of course, raises a whole other set of questions about the power dynamics within these relationships and the potential for coercion.
Yeah, that's a really important nuance to consider.
Right. And we'll definitely be unpacking those as we move forward.
What's fascinating here is that this case forces us to confront the complexities of human behavior. We often categorize people as good or bad, but the reality is much more nuanced than that. People can be capable of both kindness and cruelty, and that duality is often really difficult to reconcile.
Absolutely. And this is where I think it's important to bring in a slightly different perspective. In the midst of all these accusations, we also have an account from someone who experienced Gaiman's kindness firsthand. She talks about how he went out of his way to help her launch a career in the comics industry, a gesture that had a profound impact on her life.
That's an interesting perspective.
Right. And it speaks to that multifaceted nature of individuals and the challenges of judging someone solely based on these accusations. It reminds us that people can be capable of great acts of generosity alongside these harmful behaviors, and it's really hard to navigate that duality.
I can see how that would be challenging.
Yeah, and I want to share a little bit from her account because it really highlights this contrast. She writes, he steered me through the crowd and deposited me in front of this tall, middle-aged man. This is Christy Game. Gaiman said to the owner of an indie comics publishing company she wants to work in comics. And that was that I had a job. This is the same man who's accused of the things we've just discussed, and it's that dissonance that makes this case so perplexing.
It really highlights the complexity of human nature and the difficulty of understanding someone fully based solely on accusations.
Right.
It's a stark reminder that public figures, like all of us, are complex beings with layers that may not always align with the image they project.
Absolutely. And as we delve deeper into these allegations, I think it's vital to keep that in mind.
I agree.
We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll delve further into the evidence presented in both of these sources and really explore the emotional turmoil that this situation has caused for fans. So stay with us.
It's fascinating how this case really compels us to kind of re-examine the nature of fandom, particularly in the digital age. Gaiman's very carefully constructed online persona, the one that fostered such a strong sense of community, now adds this whole other layer of complexity to these accusations.
Yeah, it's almost as if the very thing that drew fans to him, that accessibility, that willingness to engage, now makes the allegations all the more painful. It's a personal betrayal for some, and I think a lot of people are struggling with how to reconcile their love for his work with the severity of these accusations.
Yeah, you raise a really important point there. How do you separate the art from the artist, especially when that art has been such a significant part of your life? I mean, this question has become even more prevalent in recent years as we see more and more beloved figures facing these accusations of misconduct.
Right, and there's no easy answer. It's this deeply personal struggle that I think each individual has to kind of navigate on their own. Some might choose to completely disengage from Gaiman's work, while others might find a way to compartmentalize, appreciating the art while acknowledging the harm that may have been caused.
And it's important to recognize that, fan reactions are going to be varied and complex. Some fans might feel a sense of guilt or complicity, wondering if they somehow enabled or overlooked Gaiman's behavior. Others might experience anger or denial, struggling to accept that someone they admired could be capable of such actions.
Yeah, and what I find particularly challenging is this sense of responsibility that some fans are expressing. In the New York Magazine article, the author really grapples with this idea of complicity. She writes, how can we not feel implicated? How can we not feel betrayed? She goes on to say, after all, we praised him. We showered him with affection. We bought his books, watched his movies, took his masterclass, streamed his talks, stood in line at conventions, and with our money, he coerced and financially abused women. It's a really powerful statement, and I think it speaks to the emotional turmoil that a lot of people are facing right now.
Yeah, that feeling of complicity is incredibly valid, and I think it speaks to the deep emotional investment that fans have in the creators that they admire. We build them up in our minds, often projecting our own values and ideals onto them, and when those expectations are shattered, it can be profoundly disorienting.
It really can. But I think it's crucial to remember that we as fans are not responsible for the actions of the creators we admire. We can appreciate their work, find inspiration in their stories, and, build communities around these shared interests without condoning or excusing any harmful behavior.
Right. It's about recognizing that our love for a particular work of art doesn't equate to an endorsement of the artist's personal conduct. We can draw a line separating the creative output from the individual, and I think that's a really important distinction to make, especially in cases like this.
So where do we go from here? How do we navigate this really complicated landscape where fandom and these serious allegations collide? It feels like a conversation that needs to happen, but it's such a sensitive and emotionally charged topic.
You hit the nail on the head. I think this conversation needs to happen, but it needs to be approached with empathy, with respect, and a willingness to listen to these diverse perspectives. It's not about attacking or silencing those who hold different views, but rather about creating a space for dialogue and understanding.
And it's not just about discussing this specific case, but also about using this as an opportunity to examine the broader dynamics within fandom communities. We need to be more aware of the power imbalances that can exist to set clear boundaries and to prioritize the safety and well-being of all members.
Absolutely. This situation has really highlighted the need for greater education around consent, healthy relationships, and the potential for abuse within these spaces. It's about fostering a culture where everyone feels safe, respected, and empowered to speak up if they've been harmed.
I think it's also important to shift the focus from the artist's intent to the impact of their actions. Regardless of whether Gaiman intended to cause harm, the accounts from these women describe real experiences of pain and trauma, and those experiences need to be acknowledged and taken seriously.
That's such a crucial point. We can't dismiss the harm that's been done simply because the perpetrator might not have intended it. The focus needs to be on the impact, not the intent. And that means listening to and believing survivors, creating safe spaces for them to share their stories, and holding those in positions of power accountable for their actions.
I want to circle back to the New York Magazine article for a moment because there's another piece of evidence that really stuck with me. They cite contemporaneous accounts from individuals who witnessed Gaiman's behavior firsthand, further corroborating the claims made by the accusers. This kind of corroboration adds so much weight to their stories, and it helps to establish this pattern of behavior.
Right. Having multiple sources confirming similar accounts can be extremely powerful in these cases. It strengthens the credibility of the accusations and makes it much more difficult for the accused to simply dismiss them as fabricated or exaggerated.
And while it's important to note that Gaiman has denied these accusations, we also have to consider the potential for denial and self-deception. It's not uncommon for individuals, especially those in positions of power, to minimize or rationalize their behavior even in the face of compelling evidence.
Absolutely. That's why it's so important to rely on the accounts of those who have been harmed to center their experiences and to create a system where their voices are heard and believed.
You're absolutely right, and I think this case has really highlighted the need for a more nuanced understanding of consent.
Mm.
It's not just about a yes or no, it's about the power dynamics at play. The ability to freely and enthusiastically consent without coercion or manipulation.
Exactly. Consent is an ongoing process, and it can be revoked at any time. It requires clear communication, mutual respect, and a genuine understanding of boundaries. And when those elements are missing, it's crucial to recognize that consent may not be present, regardless of what one party might claim.
This brings us to the really challenging question of how to engage with Gaiman's work moving forward. Do we boycott his books, his shows, his movies? Or is there a way to appreciate the art while acknowledging the harm that may have been caused?
That's a deeply personal decision that I think each individual has to grapple with based on their own values and beliefs. There's no right or wrong answer, and I think it's important to respect the different choices that people make.
But I think we can all agree that this situation has raised some incredibly important questions about power accountability and the responsibility that we have to create safer spaces within these fandom communities. And those are conversations that need to continue.
Absolutely. This isn't just about Neil Gaiman. This is about the systems that allow abuse to flourish, the ways that we perpetuate harmful behaviors, and the steps that we can take to create a more just and equitable environment for everyone.
And as we wrap up this segment, I want to acknowledge that this has been a really heavy and emotionally challenging conversation. If you're feeling overwhelmed or triggered by any of the topics that we've discussed, please reach out for support. There are resources available, and you are not alone in this charge.
It's so important to prioritize your own well-being and to seek help if you need it. And remember, even in the face of darkness, there's always hope for healing and positive change.
When we come back, we'll shift gears a bit and delve deeper into Gaiman's public persona, exploring how his carefully constructed image might have contributed to the shock and disbelief surrounding these allegations. So stay with us. It's wild, isn't it, how Gaiman, cultivated this persona of being the good guy author, that approachable geek who was so into connecting with his fans. Like, it's almost as if he was intentionally blurring those lines between, celebrity and friend.
It really is. And his whole online presence wasn't just about promoting his work, It was about building a community and fostering this sense of intimacy and shared passion for the things that he was writing about.
Right.
And he was early to the game with all of that, blogging, Twitter, Tumblr, all these platforms where he could interact with his readers directly.
Yeah.
Frankly, it was a pretty brilliant strategy.
Yeah, but it's also a strategy that raises some questions when these kinds of allegations come to light.
Mm-hmm.
Because that persona, the one that made him so relatable and likable, makes the accusations all the more jarring.
Yeah, it creates this real dissonance.
It does.
You have this image of him as, the witty, progressive author who champions all these important causes. And then suddenly you're confronted with these accounts of manipulation, exploitation of place. It's hard to process.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
It really is. And I think it speaks to the power of narratives and how easily we can be swayed by them.
It's like we're suddenly seeing behind the curtain
Mm.
and, realizing that the wizard might not be as benevolent as we thought.
That's a great analogy.
And I think that's what's so unsettling for a lot of fans, this realization that the person they admired so much might not be who they seemed.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that you can't really fully know someone based on their public persona, especially in the age of social media where, image management is an art form in and of itself. We tend to create these idealized versions of people in our minds. And, when those illusions are shattered, it can be pretty devastating.
It really can be. And I think it's not just about Gaiman. This case forces us to look at this larger issue, how we engage with the work of artists who have been accused of doing really awful things. It's a question that keeps coming up over and over again, and there are no easy answers.
It's an age-old question, really. Can we truly separate the art from the artist? Is it possible to enjoy something like a painting, a song, a book, without also, in some way condoning the actions of the person who created it? Ultimately, it's a dilemma I think that every individual has to grapple with, based on their own moral compass.
Right. Some people might feel totally comfortable, drawing a line in the sand, separating the work from the person. While others may find it impossible to engage with that art without feeling like they're somehow complicit in the harm that was done.
Yeah, I can understand that.
And I think, both perspectives are valid.
Absolutely. And what's really important, I think, is that we approach this entire conversation with nuance and respect for those different viewpoints. It's not about, telling people how they should feel or behave, but just creating a space for open and honest dialogue where we can share our perspectives and learn from each other.
Yeah, and maybe that's the one good thing that comes out of all of this,
Okay.
that we're finally having these hard conversations. We're acknowledging the complexities, the gray areas, and the need for real accountability in these creative industries.
It's definitely a step in the right direction. We're moving away from this binary thinking of good versus bad and embracing the reality that people are complicated and they're capable of both great and terrible things.
Yeah.
As unsettling as that can be, it's a sign that we're growing and evolving as a society.
Before we wrap up, I think it's super important to remember that this isn't just about, a celebrity scandal or a debate amongst fans. This is about real people who have come forward with their stories of pain and trauma. Their voices deserve to be heard, and their experiences need to be taken seriously.
Absolutely. And as we move forward, I think it's crucial that we prioritize the well-being of those who've been harmed. We have to create safer spaces. We have to foster a culture of accountability and make sure that anyone who comes forward with allegations of abuse is supported and believed.
I agree, and this deep dive has been a tough one. We've gone through some dark and heavy stuff, but I think it's also been a chance for us to learn and grow. It's forced us to confront uncomfortable truths, question our assumptions, and have some really critical conversations about things like power, consent, and the responsibility that we have to each other.
It's been a valuable conversation.
It really has, and as we navigate these really complicated issues, let's remember to approach them with empathy, and a commitment to creating a more just world for everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's been insightful, and we encourage you to keep exploring these important topics in your own lives and within your communities.